All right. Welcome back to the Applied Leadership Podcast. My name is Blaine Smith. I'm here as always with my good friend and business partner, Brandon Young. And we are two friends with one question, half an hour, and zero script. We got kind of a cool question this time around, and I'll see if I can phrase it succinctly. But the question is basically, how do you guys come up with this stuff? Which is a direct way of asking, what is the process that we use to create the content, the modules, the courses of instruction that we're going out and delivering to people? Because we have now 20 something kind of leadership development modules. We do keynotes and advising and a number of things in our business. And on one hand, everything we do is sort of original. Like, we don't pull really much off the shelf. We come up with most of this stuff sort of from scratch. And I say sort of from scratch because also everything that we come up with is informed by stuff we've learned and seen and work that has gone before us. So we're not claiming sort of originality on most of this stuff. I think you and I both believe pretty seriously that there's kind of nothing new under the sun, and it's just about
True.
opening up kind of new windows into the old truths, right?
Yes.
So with that as a backdrop, I do think it might be a cool conversation to give people a little bit of a peek behind the curtain as to how we go about creating this stuff. So I'll stop there. I won't say anything more, maybe send it over to you, and maybe you can give folks a little bit of perspective or a little bit of background on how a lot of these requests maybe are even initiated.
Yeah, it starts with the need. That's where it really starts.
I was hoping you would say that.
What are we trying to solve for here? What is the need and the need behind the need, right? Not just the surface level. We need difficult conversations. We need to do difficult conversations better, because the need behind that need is we're not performing to the best of our ability, and we've got to figure out ways to get where we're trying to go. So it's always, there's multiple levels, but to start, anything that we have created in all these modules, presentations, keynotes, writings, it starts with the need. And so by virtue of that, when we started our business, we did so with the intent to let the market speak to us and tell us what they needed and tell us, who. Like, we kind of had an idea of who would really respond to our approach. People who have some type of military affinity, they appreciate what two special operators have done in their lives, and the fact that we probably have done enough leadership in enough difficult environments to be able to translate that. People who understand that we have translated that into the real world, quote unquote, and business life and all that kind of stuff, and have demonstrated effectiveness. But we never said this is kind of our shiny rock that we're foisting upon everybody into the world. We went to the world and said, what do you need right now? What's happening within your business? Help us understand. Help us get down to the rock bottom of what the need is, and then let's go from there. And so it always starts with the need for better communication, the need for an increased sense of trust amongst the team, a need for clear empowerment and clear lines of accountability, things like this. And so before we even get to the lab to wrap our heads around the creation process, which is one of the most enjoyable parts of our business, is actually getting around a whiteboard, getting a jam going. And I will tell you this, it's also creativity is a fascinating thing because it is so fluid and it can be so hard to kind of pin down, and having the dedicated time to do that is so important, right? You can't go to the lab and start, creating if you have no time to do it or if you have no tools to do it with. And I mention that because it's important to note that we have a standing 90-minute meeting on our calendar once a week, and it is called Creative Jam. And we go to the lab. That's the lab. And we have been doing it now for almost 5 years. We've had this standing meeting on our calendar, And from here on out, that standing meeting is one of my favorites, and I intend for it to stay, and it is always protected. So we go out, we find the need, then we come to the lab, which we have dedicated time, and then we start to really think about and talk about how do we address this need.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate you starting there, because that is such a key point. And you and I are lucky enough to talk to people who want to get into leadership development or are interested in kind of being in the space that we're in professionally. And one of the things that we always end up telling everybody is, don't worry too much about like whatever your shtick is. You need to start spending time with people and finding out what their needs are. And then, and this is kind of the agreement we've made with ourselves, I think, Brandon, is that if somebody asks us if we can help them with something, and we believe genuinely that we can, we will just say yes. And if we don't have something tailor-made already to address that specifically, we will go into the lab and we will build it for them. And we will do our very best to help them with it. And I think we do a pretty good job of that. And then if the feedback is good, we now have that arrow that we sort of put in our quiver. And now we can offer that one a bit more proactively to people if the conversation goes that way. And if the next conversation we have is like, hey, I need something totally different. If it's something that we don't do, which occasionally does happen, we're just like, I just don't think we're the folks for that, then we'll say so.
Yeah.
But if we genuinely believe we can help you with that, we generally understand that, we'll go into the lab and figure it out and come back with something that we think is going to be really useful. And I think that's a good approach. And if you get 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, eventually you do have a bit of a menu. You have a better understanding of kind of how you approach these things, which is more where we're at now. And so now when we're having these kind of discovery conversations, we can pick up on themes. We can recognize things we've seen in other clients and partners, and we might be able to more easily pair their needs with something that we've already built. But that's still not always the case. I think being open-minded to the market telling you what they need is really important. As it relates to the lab specifically, you've kind of referred to this. How do we start? Like we were just doing this earlier today, and I don't know that we have a real specific process other than to get to the whiteboard, get a Google Doc open if we're working remotely, and just kind of say, what do you think about executive presence as an example? Like, what does that mean to you? And we just kind of start batting it around. That's my estimation of how we do this in a very general sense. I think what's helpful is we have an idea of where we're going now. Like we have a good idea of what a kind of module or presentation is structured like, so we can have a little bit of scaffolding. But for the most part, I think we just start with, I don't know, when you hear that phrase, what do you think? And we just kind of start kicking it around. Do I have that about right?
Yeah, that's exactly how it starts. And we just have a conversation about it. It truly starts with a conversation. And I don't think we do really have necessarily like, for example, we don't go to the lab and say, okay, I'm going to spend the next 3 hours in the library, in the digital library, researching this topic and seeing what everybody else has to say about it. That's an important thing to note. It's not that we aren't, you've already made it super clear. Like we genuinely believe that, like there's nothing new under the sun, right? There's a lot of, thoughts and frames out there, but that's just not our process. Our process is not to go to the lab and start researching and compiling a bunch of data. Our process begins with a genuine conversation about the given topic. Where have you seen this in your life? What do you think about this? Where have you experienced this? Where has it gone bad? Where has it gone well? Thinking about some of those things. Can you think about a situation in your life, which usually comes a little bit, I would say, in the middle of the process? At some point in time, we think about like, it's like I remember being in Ranger School, or I remember when we were just starting to really scale Team RWB. We had like 32 communities, and then before we knew it, we had 100, and then before we knew it, we had 150, and then we had a 200, and it didn't happen by accident. What were the kind of ingredients of the special sauce that happened in there? And so that's kind of it. Is we have this pattern of discussing something, recalling maybe themes that we have seen, whether it's in our professional life, in, professionals that are kind of adjacent to us, or things that we know. And then we start to really take that example and peel it apart and really start to figure out what's the special sauce that really made this thing so sweet, really so good, as kind of part of the process as well.
Yeah, I really love your mention of the secret sauce there, because that's something that we made a real commitment to back when we worked together at Team RWB. Was we had this kind of lightning in a bottle special sauce thing going on that you could feel if you were a part of it at all. But and I remember being very staunch about this, like, we are not going to give ourselves a pass on having secret sauce. We have to now do the hard work to reverse engineer the secret sauce so we can actually know what it is made of, what ingredients in what proportion, mixed together in what way, are making it this way. We have to figure this stuff out. We can't just assume it's going to be there forever. And that is a lot what we do with these leadership topics, is we just take the time to think about, like, if there's a kind of a well accepted phrase or some pithy saying or something that's like, you have to have trust. Like, okay, great. What exactly does that mean? What is trust really? We just start having this conversation, and a lot of cool stuff tends to sort of bubble up out of that. And I think what we have found is, in many cases, what we come up with doesn't look that different than what we may have come up with if we had done like a literary review and like come up with a framework more academically. But I always feel so much better about everything we share, because I know that we've put in the rigor to really think about it based on our own experience from first principles. And if it shakes out to be very akin to something that's in a textbook, I'm fine with that. And if it's something a bit different, I'm great with that too. I think some of the best stuff that we've delivered to audiences or to clients has been the stuff that makes them say, you know what? That makes sense. I've never really quite thought about it that way. That's really handy. I mean, that's what we're going for a lot of the times. I don't think we're ever trying to be novel for the sake of being novel, but I do think we are always trying to be completely genuine with how we're approaching it. And that's a slightly different thing. There's the great C.S. Lewis quote about, you don't really need to try to be original. If you just tell the truth consistently, you'll almost by default become original. Stop worrying so much about being clever or unique. And I think that's been a really core aspect of our approach, is just to be honest, be genuine, tell the truth, find it within ourselves and through our own experience. And then we can, if we have to, reconcile it with what the world has to say about it.
Yeah. And focus more on being useful than brilliant. Or as we like to remind each other all the time, resist the urge to be profound. If it's so profound that it's so out of touch, then it's frankly useless, right? And if it's so simple and it works, great, then it's useful, right? Now it can't be overly simple, of course, because then it's kind of like, well, I don't need you guys. But it has to be, it has to really be genuine and useful. That's what we're really going for here. And I think about, the funny thing is, honestly, this is how this podcast got started.
Yeah.
Actually. Because after so many years of us doing these reps together where we were creative jamming, a number of times you said, like, man, I think people might be interested in hearing this kind of stuff. They might be truly interested in hearing how we just kind of riff and think about things. So, why not? Let's put it out there. And that's how this podcast got started. We literally do just what we're doing right now. We take a question, a need in this case, we throw it up against the whiteboard, and then we just kind of start talking about it and starting to figure out, where it comes from. And I like the fact that you have pointed out, what we come to in the end. I think about it like ingredients, right? Like, we don't give people recipes, but we give them the ingredients, because we give them a framework. We come away from our creative process with the intent of having a useful framework. We've talked about trust a couple times. For example, CARE. CARE, candor, authenticity, reliability, and empathy. You can't just slap the table and say we all have trust. And you can't have a shortcut to building trust, But if you think about this framework, candor, authenticity, reliability, and empathy, you will be able to have a shared language that will increase speed to trust. That's a framework. What it's not is it is not a recipe, or in other ways, it is not a script, because people aren't, you can't like throw people, you can't say, here's my script now for building trust with you. Candor. First thing I have to do is candor. I am well today. How are you? That's not how it works, right? And frankly, it's weird. So you don't want to do that. Don't make it weird. And when we come out of these things, we usually have kind of the recipes, like, look, you're going to need these kind of things. You're going to want to think about it, but it's flexibly applicable to your situation. So think about that. Here, not a do this, do that, but have a framework. Let's get you some principles. We learn best through stories. Let's tell some stories so that you can see what this looks like. Let's think about a framework so that you can apply it. Think about it in your space and then apply it to your space so that we can further reflect and continue to apply. That's kind of how we come out of it. You mentioned like the framework that we have, or the structure that we have coming out of it. But let's talk a little bit about what's the actual process, okay? So we have 90 minutes, we do a creative jam, then what happens?
Yeah.
Because
well, it's usually going to take more than one creative jam, which I think is really worth saying as well. Like, we might take 90 minutes on a Wednesday and do our best and get usually a Google Doc going. And I usually have a lot of notes in my notebook as well of how I'm sketching this out. And so we've got something to start having a bit of a frame for how we're thinking about it. And we might just have to press pause and come back to it in a couple of days when we have some more time on our calendar to come back to it. And then when it's time to do that again, we'll kind of re-enter the lab, pick up where we left off, make sure that we're on the same page, and start to further develop it. And, typically where it goes from there is we'll start to identify what are the few really key principles about this subject that we need to make sure we get on the table early. Do we have some anecdotes or stories that really highlight this in a colorful way that people are going to be like, yep, I totally can see it there? If so, what are those? And then finally, what is a framework through which people can actually apply this? Again, going back to there not being like a script or a recipe. This is all like teach to fish kind of stuff. And we'll start trying to tease that out, and we'll play around for a little bit. And I'll say, how about this? And you'll say, that's close, I think. What if it's this? And we'll just kind of keep working with it. And eventually that Google Doc becomes like a script for us, not for the audience, right? Which is, if we're going to present this, how is this going to flow? And then who's going to say what? And what's the example we're going to use? And we'll just build all that out. And then we'll build some slides that kind of go alongside that script in parallel. So there's always at least two documents there that we know we're going to use for presenting. And then we typically build almost always we build a one-page takeaway document that are, kind of the principles, the story, and the framework on a one-pager. And then for basically all of them now, we'll also build a worksheet for reflection and application that are basically just more questions that people can ask themselves with regard to this topic. Where have I seen this? How do I think about it? How could I do this, et cetera, et cetera. But that is basically a module. It's a script and a set of slides with a takeaway document and a worksheet. And we just kind of keep doing that on every topic. And I guess the other thing that I want to point out, though, is that that's never the end of the line for that module. We have one later this afternoon that we've done, I don't know, dozens of times at least. And we've had 2 rehearsals this week to make sure that we know what we're doing. We've had to refine the script a little bit to make sure we do a good and relevant job for this particular customer. That's a big part of the creative process as well, is you don't just do it one time. The sausage has to get made kind of fresh every single time. And we might be using a module we've done a bunch of times, but we're always going to go back, look at it, make sure we understand it, change some small things to make it relevant, rehearse to make sure we know what we're doing, and then go. So like part of the lab is rehearsal / refinement space as well, not just pure kind of 0 to 1 space.
Yeah. And with that refinement and rehearsal, as we have grown and brought in other leaders like Sarah Holzhab, Matt Kress, Ben Davis, for example, folks who are coming up and presenting with us on the podium, they have also sharpened us and brought different perspectives to it. You talk about that rehearsal that we've just done. We had Ben Davis in on that, and just hearing some of his thoughts and how, oh yeah, that principle makes me think of commander's intent, and how commander's intent is so important because, so on and so forth. And that's an addition to the content, right? It's there's just, how could we not take the opportunity to further refine and grow and develop from a leader like a Ben Davis or a Matt Kress or a Sarah Holzhab or folks who have also been out there and done incredible things in the world. And that has been such a fun part of the process too. And it's a little different, right? It's a little different than you and me chopping it up like this and kind of figuring it out, because, frankly, we've been doing that since 2010 at the Don Cesar, right? Like, we've been doing that for a long time, and we've been having these conversations and thinking about things like this. But I love how you've brought in the element of refinement. And I also just want to mention that, it's been a real cool thing to open that up and get more feedback and other perspectives in there, not just from those leaders who are coming up and presenting with us, but we get sharpened and refined by our partners all the time. We think about things and they help us to consistently articulate it and change it and make it better. And that's been such a beautiful part of the creative process, because the creativity is never really done.
No, not at all. And this is where I would make a strong case to have a business partner or a thought partner or whatever you want to call it. If you want to do anything that's a real creative endeavor. You and I were just talking yesterday with regard to the book, how there's just no chance that it ever gets done, or certainly doesn't get done to the level of quality that it was without us working together on it. And some people can go
Right.
into their office and write a book and do it mostly on their own. Although I would submit that no really good book is a one-person effort, right? There are editors and publishers and all kinds of people on the team.
For sure.
But even just in the writing of the book itself, it was just a back and forth process and a collective process between you and I. And whether it's a blog post or the chapter of a book, a lot of what we do also that we haven't really mentioned here is that there are times when you'll get an idea or I'll get an idea and just write it down, and it might come out in the form of a blog post. It might come out in the form of like a one-pager, might be a sketch in a notebook or on a whiteboard. Yeah. But that also happens. We're driving around and listening to podcasts or out on a run, and we get an idea. And, I often will email myself. So for my personal email address, I'll email my work email address and be like, hey, these 6 bullet points, remember this and come back to it. So I've got a handful of emails in my inbox all the time that are nuggets of ideas that have sprung into my head. And sometimes I'll bring that to the Creative Jam and say, hey, I've been noodling on this idea. What do you think? And it will grow from there. Or I might write a 500-word blog post, kick it over to you and be like, what do you think about this? And we'll edit each other's work. So that's an important part of the process as well, is not having too much pride of ownership. Not only in not trying to be profound or super original with the content for our clients, but even the stuff that we're putting out on the blog or on social media. I think we just want something that's useful to people. And I'm perfectly happy for you or Sarah or anybody else to modify or edit or otherwise adopt an idea that I have, if it's going to be more resonant with people and be more valuable to them. And I think that's a big part of the creative process that we don't want to just leave out, is this idea that, yeah, it's fun to work collaboratively, but you also have to be willing to, let go of this happens all the time. There'll be some turn of phrase or some like little, clever saying that one of us will come up with that we'll really want to have incorporated. But then like over time, it's like, we're just not going to get that in there, are we? It just doesn't really
I got to
fit.
let it go.
I can't shoehorn that one in there, as clever as it is.
Damn it.
That's a big part of doing this and doing it with other people, is you have to do it in service of the need, which is where we started. You cannot do it in service of yourself. If you do that, people are going to see right through it, and you're just going to be another person on the internet or on the podium who's trying to show everyone how clever you are and how smart you are and how badass you used to be. And you can get 1 gig at a time doing that and get paid and move on, but it's very hard to have a meaningful lasting relationship with a partner or a client if that's your shtick, you know.
I'm so glad that you mentioned this, because it has been something that I have really learned over the last 5 to 10 years, which is that it's the willingness to take and incorporate feedback, and the manner in which it is given, and the manner in which you must give it. It must be done, thoughtfully. It must be done gracefully and graciously, and it must be done in a sense of truth and love come to mind for me. Because I remember, the first couple times that I started to open myself up for that, it was really hard. It was hard because but I was really in love with that sentence, and I don't want that sentence to go. But as I have grown over the years, and I think the first time that I ever really wrote something for public consumption, I think I kicked it over to our friend Marty Skovlin. At the time, he was running the Havoc Journal, and it was just something that I felt really compelled to write about. And getting his kind of thoughts and feedback on it was the first time that I had exposed myself to that. Or even putting a long form article out into the world was the first time I had exposed myself not only to the feedback of a thought partner, a collaborator, but also the feedback of the public, right? Because now I'm really, putting myself out there, which, I'm to be honest with you, it's kind of hard. You really got to, it's something that I consistently have to work at. But going back to our creative process, you've mentioned this, and I think it is valuable. Our book, Perseverance is Greater Than Endurance, which is live for pre-order right now on Simon & Schuster, and also will be published February of next year. It'll be published February of next year. We wrote that book together, right? And the way that we did that is very similar to the way that we do even our articles and our blogs, which is we'll talk about it, we'll think about it, we'll kind of get a frame or at least a draft in mind. One of the two of us will take point on kind of getting the words down on paper. So for that book, you will notice that, there's the order in which some of the names on the chapters are reversed in some cases, because you took point on writing it down and then kicked it over to me, or I took point on writing it down and kicking it over to you. And then we consistently work through it then before we ship the product until we feel like we have created what we are trying to say in the way that it is most useful for the audience. And you really need to have a lot of trust. Here comes trust again. You really got to have a lot of trust to have that kind of relationship. And I totally agree. Having a partner, having a thought partner, having somebody that you can collaborate with is so critical. And the trust level has got to be really high there to know that we are for each other, that we are for the need, that we are for the partner or the audience and what we're trying to say. Because so many times I can write something down and be really in love with the way that it sounds, and just full transparency, more often than not, Blaine will come back and say to me like, hey, this comes across pretty sharp. You might, I think what you're trying to say is this. And I'm like, yes, that is what I'm trying to say. Thank you. Because it wasn't coming across the way that I was hoping for it to come across, and you've made it 20 times better. So it has to have that trust, but then the willingness to actually accept it and move with it. And that's such a big part of our creative process. So this is actually probably a good place where we can just kind of wrap it up for this episode, which is to say that we would really encourage, number one is that if you don't have any time on your calendar, if you don't have a committed creative process, and whether you are putting out anything into the world like we are in terms of articles or blogs or things like that, or you're a mid-level manager or a manager or a leader in a healthcare company, it doesn't matter where you are, but dedicating some time on your calendar for you to think, for you to create, we would encourage you to do that. We would encourage you to have a process. We would also encourage you to consider how you can incorporate a thought partner, somebody that you can think of these things with, somebody that you can bounce ideas off of, that will continue to further sharpen you. That has been really beneficial to us, is to have that dedicated time, to have the partner to think about these things, and always to start with the end in mind. In other words, to address the real need and to really think about what you're trying to say and put out into the world will really help you shape some effectiveness. That's how we create. Thanks for the question. We're glad you guys are interested in the way that we create, and we hope this has been valuable for you. With that in mind, please continue to send your questions to us at contact@appliedleadershippartners.com, and we will get to them, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.